Last year, the U.S. policy on China abruptly changed. In his official capacity, Vice President Mike Pence spoke openly of the threat of the communist regime in China, much more so than any U.S. leader had done in decades.
But I come before you today because the American people deserve to know that as we speak, Beijing is employing a whole-of-government approach, using political, economic, and military tools as well as propaganda to advance its influence and benefit its interests in the United States.
What caused this major shift in U.S. China strategy? Why exactly does communist China pose a national security threat to America and many other nations? And how does the Chinese regime endanger basic freedoms worldwide? And what are possible responses to this threat? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. In this special episode of American Thought Leaders, we revisit the testimonies of a broad field of China experts who spoke at the China's Global Challenge to Democratic Freedom Forum, hosted by the Hudson Institute and Freedom House last October. This was on the very same stage where Vice President Mike Pence made his speech 3 weeks earlier. I was actually on one of the panels myself, speaking about the challenges of our Chinese language Epoch Times and sister media, Chinese NTD Television, have faced at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, because they dared to remain independent truth tellers. Today, while criminal charges against Chinese telecom giant Huawei and the U.S. China trade war dominates headlines, let's take a look at what the Chinese regime has been doing over the past few decades to create a massive web of influence.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, we assumed that a free China was inevitable. Heady with optimism at the turn of the 21st century, America agreed to give Beijing open access to our economy, and we brought China into the World Trade Organization. Previous administrations made this choice in the hope that freedom in China would expand in all of its forms, not just economically, but politically, with a newfound respect for classical liberal principles, private property, personal liberty, religious freedom, the entire family of human rights. But that hope has gone unfulfilled.
Safeguarding our democracies from the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian and corrupting influence.
If you don't have an active press looking into this.
An increasing assertiveness from Chinese leadership and a desire to shape the world around China in a way that is beneficial to China's future in the long run.
For decades, the Chinese regime promised its rise on the world stage was peaceful, and many governments, businesses, and academics believed it. But now, a different image is emerging of a communist regime working to aggressively, and at the same time covertly, undermine freedom worldwide. In its 70-year history, the Chinese Communist Party has persecuted waves of Chinese people to consolidate and maintain its political power. Today, the Communist Party still suppresses people of faith, including Falun Gong practitioners, House Christians, Uyghur Muslims, and Tibetan Buddhists. Dissenting voices such as rights lawyers and activists are also brutally repressed. But it's not just about what the regime is doing within its own borders.
As history attests, though, a country that oppresses its own people rarely stops there. And Beijing also aims to extend its reach across the wider world.
The Chinese Communist Party is focused on lowering the antibodies of a democratic society.
It's inevitably in conflict with open societies, with our values, with our institutions, with our civil liberty.
So it's no longer about engaging China to promote liberal reforms in China, but it's equally about safeguarding our democracies from the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian and corrupting influence.
Efforts to safeguard democracy are challenged by the CCP's multi-pronged approach to build influence in each country it targets.
The Chinese Communist Party uses money rather than communist ideology as a powerful source of influence, creating these sort of parasitic relationships of long-term dependence that we see both at universities, at newspapers, and many other sort of Western institutions.
And when money doesn't work, the communist regime uses strong-arm tactics to intimidate or coerce others to bend to their wishes. In America, thugs of Chinese origin have, beaten up our staff. It uses a communist strategy known as the United Front to influence foreign actors to serve Beijing's interests.
United Front strategy has been sort of elevated and expanded, and it's often been called a sort of so-called magic weapon, which relies on both co-opting Chinese diaspora communities and equally on building relationship with Western enablers to make the sort of foreign serve the Chinese Communist Party. That often means limiting the parameters of debate about China in Western democratic governments and civil society so that they do not pose a sort of threat to the Chinese Communist Party.
Australia was the first to confront the issue of Chinese communist influence after it was revealed that wealthy Chinese businessmen with ties to United Front groups donated heavily to its two major political parties.
Now, we have recently seen disturbing reports about Chinese influence.
As a result, the country introduced laws in 2018 to counter the threat of foreign influence.
Now, we will not tolerate foreign influence activities that are in any way covert, coercive or corrupt.
The regime has also set its sights on Western media, offering outlets money to run narratives promoting a positive view of the Chinese Communist Party. From paying for advertorial inserts made to look like news, to giving media outlets perks and access.
A couple of days later, an article in Vox comes out with essentially the same headline and same argument. But then at the very bottom of the article, quote, "This reporting was supported by the China-United States Exchange Foundation." They didn't even realize, even after I pointed it out, what they had done, which is, again, taken a bunch of gifts from the United Front in order to do reporting on China.
One panelist described a particular case of Chinese influence on a media outlet in South America.
We saw the Chinese ambassador going to the newsroom of this, visiting the newsroom of this newspaper. So after those visits, this newspaper signed a deal with the People's Daily. Then they were invited to an event, to executives of this newspaper, to visit, to go to a conference in Beijing about the One Belt, One Road initiative. Now don't see almost any criticism of China in that newspaper anymore.
And when that approach doesn't work, the panelists said the Chinese Communist Party works behind the scenes to muzzle their critics. For about a year, we had people in NASDAQ reporting from there. And one of the executives from NASDAQ was in China. He got pulled in, got interrogated by Chinese authorities while in China. And the next month, suddenly our reporters were all expelled from NASDAQ. And we had no idea why, right? It was only years later that when the WikiLeaks cables were published that we realized, oh, I see, this is what happened. The CCP is also using various tactics to pressure media outlets to self-censor, says Freedom House senior analyst Sarah Cook.
They really comprise a systematic effort to signal in many cases to commercial partners and media owners that their operations in China and access to Chinese citizens will be jeopardized if they assist, do business with, or refrain from censoring voices the CCP has designated as politically undesirable.
But it's not only journalists self-censoring. Western academics feel the pressure too.
Do we China scholars self-censor? You bet we do.
Top China scholar Professor Perry Link warned about the regime's malign effect on academic freedom almost 2 decades ago. He said the Chinese regime bred a culture of fear among China scholars, not by direct threats, but by unspoken threats of being arbitrarily detained or being denied access to sources in China.
Does self-censorship in the scholarly world exist? Not only does it exist, it's everywhere. It's by far the rule, not the exception. The costs of doing this are to the U.S. public. That's the most painful part of it to me.
One panelist spoke of the great lengths one academic allegedly went to maintain access to China.
In order to get off the blacklist, he agreed to pass on information about his students to a Chinese intelligence officer, and he got his visa back.
There's also Confucius Institutes spreading influence on college campuses.
What are Confucius Institutes in classrooms? Basically, they are Chinese government-sponsored centers on campuses.
Classes, textbooks, and teachers are paid for by the Chinese regime.
There's a lot of censorship, self-censorship, in some cases, propaganda.
A 2018 report by the U.S. China Commission warned that Confucius Institutes advance Beijing's preferred narrative and subvert important academic principles such as institutional autonomy and academic freedom. More than 100 colleges and universities in the United States host Confucius Institutes. At least 10 have closed their programs amid growing concerns from Washington. Chinese student associations on campuses have also become a tool of the Chinese Communist Party, under intimidation by Chinese diplomats in the United States.
The repressive Chinese government is weaponizing Chinese students, overseas Chinese students, to curb academic freedom on the Western campus.
Two recent events at Canadian universities highlight this issue. At Toronto's McMaster University, Chinese international students protested a talk given by a Uyghur rights activist, Rukia Tudouche, about the regime's human rights violations in Xinjiang province.
And a few Chinese students tried to disturb me during my speech, and one of them actually verbally insulted me during the discussion period.
2 days later, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association released a statement saying they reported the event to the Chinese consulate. At the University of Toronto Scarborough, Kemi Lamo, a Tibetan-born Canadian, received thousands of hateful messages from Chinese international students after she was elected president of the University Student Union. Foreign companies are also finding themselves in the crosshairs. If they don't toe the party line, they risk losing access to the world's second-largest market.
Tell every international airline they have to pretend that the country of Taiwan doesn't exist. If you don't do that, well, you're not going to be able to fly into China on your airline anymore. And that is exactly taking this and threatening punishment to shape behavior for American and international corporations.
This happened in February, when Chinese authorities forced an Air New Zealand flight en route to Shanghai to turn back mid-air, reportedly because the airline's paperwork made reference to Taiwan as an independent country. Vice President Pence pointed out the hard truth of Beijing's behavior.
That the Chinese Communist Party is trying to undermine academic freedom and the freedom of speech in America today.
He also acknowledged a prominent and long-term China advisor to multiple U.S. administrations.
As Hudson's own Dr. Michael Pillsbury has written, China has opposed the actions and goals of the United States government. Indeed, China is building its own relationships with America's allies and enemies that contradict any peaceful or productive intentions of Beijing.
Dr. Pillsbury's book, The 100-Year Marathon, describes the Chinese leader's drawn-out method of surpassing the United States. In a statement to the U.S. House Intelligence Committee, Pillsbury said, "My thesis in the 100-Year Marathon is, while Americans have the illusion we have been managing China's rise, the truth is the other way around. China has been doing a much better job of managing America's decline."
My book is about how deeply held these beliefs are in China, how long they've gotten away with this, and a kind of a warning I've given to my friends in the Trump administration that please don't underestimate what we're dealing with. What we're going to do to stop this is probably going to depend on the Congress.
Pillsbury also stated this is clearly a bipartisan national security matter. He re-emphasized this at the Hudson Freedom House Forum.
So if a Trump person agrees with Laura Rosenberger, that's already good news. We're going to have action by the U.S. government.
But government cannot combat the threat alone.
Use the bully pulpit and call out colleges and universities when they have sold their academic integrity to an authoritarian foreign government, and come out on record and express concerns about Confucius Institutes.
Could also have independent Western newspapers go together and make a code of conduct of saying you won't accept the sort of Chinese insert.
It's about being vigilant, being resilient, and shoring up our defenses.
We have to be precise about what we're combating. We have to combat it as a unified country, understanding that it's not about our party politics and it's not about a single politician.
Only we fight back, to push back, and defend ourselves and defend our freedom. That for those under the Chinese authoritarian regime can learn a lesson.
This is just a small selection of what thought leaders on China have to say about the Chinese Communist regime's plans to subvert America, freedom, and expand its influence worldwide.